In the last lesson, we looked at the three causes that led to the French Revolution. That began in 1789. What we'll look at here are some of the events and changes over time in the first 3 years of that revolution. The revolution lasts for many years, and it is marked by 4 different stages throughout time. We're going to look primarily at this first period known as the moderate constitutional period, which lasts from 1789 to 92. The radical period begins in 1792, and the Reign of Terror follows as part of the radical period, particularly in 93 and 94. Then we'll look at the moderate reaction and the Napoleonic Age in later videos. So as we saw in the last lesson, the Third Estate, which were the commoners, had been invited by the king to join the Estates General and state their mind, but the king wasn't really interested in hearing their position. So, after being locked out of the Estates General, they gathered in a tennis court and took an oath that they would not separate until they were able to form a new government with a new constitution. Hearing about this decision by the National Assembly, who are now seeking to form that new constitution, the king prepared force to put down the revolutionaries. In response, the revolutionaries felt like they needed weapons, and they heard that some of the weapons were kept in an old prison known as the Bastille. As a result, they stormed the Bastille on July 14th. The Bastille was defended by the prison warden and the rest of his staff, but eventually the revolutionaries broke through anyway, beheading the warden and killing the other staff. They released the 7 prisoners who were kept in that prison. It wasn't a very populated prison, and failed to find any ammunition and weapons. They were so upset by this that they decided to destroy the Bastille and put it to fire as a symbol of their determination to fight against the king. They also pressed forward in their plans to form a new constitution. And though the Declaration of the Rights of Man is not a full constitution, we do see the beginnings of a government based not on the absolute power of the king, but on the ability of the people to work together and recognize the natural rights that Enlightenment philosophers had encouraged people to follow. So that was in August of 1789. So within just that summer, revolution had begun and a new government had been set up. Unfortunately, however, the king refused to accept this new government. He was an absolute monarch. The very idea of the people getting to choose, period, that they didn't like this government didn't make sense to him. And to recognize the rights of man from this declaration? Absolutely not. However, the situation was getting worse in Paris. Food was even more scarce. Bread was even more expensive. More people were hungry. And so, as the king refused to listen to them, women from Paris armed themselves with pitchforks and weapons and marched on Versailles, which is the palace of the king, a few miles out from Paris. So they marched from Paris to Versailles and took over the palace, forcing the king to listen to their demands and bringing himself and the queen back to Paris. At this beginning stage of the revolution, known as the moderate period, most of the revolutionaries were not interested in getting rid of the king. They simply wanted their rights recognized. And that is exactly what happens in the Constitution of 1791. So it took a couple years to fully write it, but by 1791, a constitution had been written. And in this constitution, all men 25 or older could vote. This is a huge step towards democracy and a say within the government. In fact, all the government officials were elected, which meant the people chose them, no longer absolute power. But they still recognized the existence of a king, and that's what we see right here with a constitutional monarchy. A constitutional monarchy still recognizes that there should be a king, hence a monarchy, but not an absolute monarchy. He doesn't have absolute power. He has to listen instead to the Constitution, which has been agreed to by the people. This was an opportunity for Louis XVI to simply listen to their demands and go along with the revolutionaries and still have power within government. But this did not make sense to Louis XVI, and he was not remotely interested in listening. And so, at the end of that same year, King Louis XVI, instead of following along with the idea of the constitutional monarchy, resisted it and called for help from his friends in Europe. He's related to some of the other kings in Europe. His wife, Marie Antoinette, is the sister of the current king of Austria, so Louis XVI asks for help from him. Austria invades the eastern border of France, and Louis XIV runs away to try to join those forces. It's a terrible mistake. The revolutionaries find him, bring him back, and now want nothing to do with him. While at first most of the people of France were interested in having the king as part of the government, because he had resisted for so long, they were ready for something entirely new. And so at the beginning of 1792, we have a more radical period which included a commune, where the people of Paris tried to join together to have more of a say in everything that happened within government. This was led by Danton, and the people in it were known as sans-culottes, which referred to the clothing they wore, which was very different than the nobles and the rich people of the previous government. They formed a republic which had nothing to do with the king, no monarchy whatsoever, and was led mostly by the middle class, recognizing the rights of the people. However, it was strongly marked by division between leaders. We're going to see how that's going to play into the history moving forward. 1792 began with more of these radical ideas. Radical means extreme. And the number one event which marks the change from a more constitutional period to this more radical extreme period was the beheading of Louis XVI at the beginning of 1792. The response of Europe is tremendous. You don't behead a king. That's just not done. And so England goes to war with France. Other powers join with England. Austria is continuing to fight on the eastern border. France is a mess. Concerned that revolution is going to end, a new committee is set up as part of this First Republic, and it is known as the Committee of Public Safety. It is headed by a man named Maximilien Robespierre, who is going to lead the revolution in an increasingly radical direction.